right, let's start. On behalf of the Center for Chinese Studies at UH Manoa, I would like to welcome everyone to our Fall 2022 CCS webinar series. My name is Yu Mingbao from the Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures, where I teach 20th century Chinese literature, film, and culture. And I'm currently also serving as the CCS director and the organizer of this year's webinar series, with the kind assistance of CCS Executive Committee and CCS Associate Director Ren Yumei Cindy Ning. Today's session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our CCS YouTube channel, where you can also find previously recorded CCS webinar sessions in case you missed them. Our full program flyer for this semester can be found on the CCS website and Instagram, the links of which you can now see in the chat forum. I encourage you to take a closer look at our program flyer for this semester, because we have an impressive lineup of presentations coming up, including next week's interdisciplinary and interregional faculty panel on President Biden's Indo-Pacific policy and strategy, featuring Professor Zhiqing Zhu from Bucknell University as our main speaker. Today's session is the first one this semester featured in our series Understanding China, and it is co-sponsored by the Sociology departments at UH Manoa and the University of Pennsylvania and their Annenberg School for Communication. We would like to acknowledge and thank all three units for their support. We are extremely honored and fortunate today to welcome Professor Yang Guobin from the University of Pennsylvania. He has kindly agreed to engage in a conversation with us on his erudite and lucid book, The Wuhan Lockdown, that was published in February this year by Columbia University Press. Since the book's publication, Professor Yang has been in high demand, giving book talks all over the country as well as in China. So we are very lucky and grateful that he could fit us into his busy schedule. Before I introduce my colleague, Professor Wei Zhang, who will serve as the moderator of today's session and properly introduce Professor Yang, allow me to remind you of some logistical issues. Please use the chat forum for posting any technical or other queries, but use the Q&A tool you see at the bottom of your screen to send comments and questions about the presentations. We will monitor it and present your questions to our speakers during the Q&A session. Please don't wait to send your questions until the very end, because then we might run out of time to answer them. In order to accommodate everyone, we kindly ask that you please keep your comments concise and ask no more than 2 questions, so we keep within the 30 minutes we have allocated to the Q&A session. We will try to answer the questions in the order they have been submitted, but we might also synthesize or group together similar questions so that we save time and make room for other comments and queries. After today's presentation, we sent out a brief survey to our audience, and we would greatly appreciate if you can give us your feedback. Okay, and now it gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Wei Zhang, who is professor and chair of the Sociology department here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She is a trained medical sociologist, and her primary research interest is to examine health disparities among Asian Americans and other older adults using secondary data analyses. So, without further ado, Professor Zhang Wei.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mingbao Yu, for your great introduction. So today we are so honored to be able to invite Dr. Guobin Yang to be our guest speaker. Dr. Guobin Yang is the Grace Lee Boggs Professor of Communications and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, and also the director of its Center on Digital Culture and Society. He's the author of the award-winning 2 books. One is called The Power of the Internet in China, Citizen Activism Online, and the other is called The Red Guard Generation and Political Activism in China. Both books were published with Columbia University Press. So today we're gonna really discuss his new book, Wuhan Lockdown, which was also published by Columbia University Press. Many of you might know Dr. Yang very well already, because even had opportunities to work with Dr. Yang many years ago, because Dr. Yang used to be a faculty member here at the Sociology department at UH Manoa. I joined our unit, Department of Sociology, in 2007. So this perfectly missed Dr. Yang, who was at that time recruited by Columbia University and left our unit. But today, I'm so honored to get a chance to welcome Dr. Yang back to his home department via an online platform and to have a conversation with Dr. Yang and learn more about his recent book, The Wuhan Lockdown. Myself, with great interest, I finished reading this book in 2 weeks and using my fragmented time here and there with the kids' noise in my background, but I just cannot put down the book and keep reading until I finish. I feel like this book is super amazing, not only because it vividly portrayed ordinary people's life, their resilience and endurance during the 76 days of Wuhan lockdown, but also because it crafted fascinating pictures of the contemporary Chinese society, including its political environment, the internet culture, various forms of civil organizations, doctor-patient relationships, medical system, and its foreign policies, or changing forms of its foreign policies nowadays. These contents help us and help readers connect the dots and linking seemingly unrelated topics into a very coherent one to help us make sense of the Wuhan lockdown. So this book, to me, is not entirely about the pandemic per se, about the Wuhan lockdown per se. It is actually a handbook for understanding contemporary Chinese society. So without further ado, let us warmly welcome Dr. Yang Guobin to do a short presentation of the book first, and then we will start the conversation. Welcome, Dr. Yang Guobin.
Thank you, Professor Wei Zhang, for your very kind and generous introduction, and thank you, and Mingbao, for the kind invitation. This is a very special invitation for me, and it's really a great pleasure and honor. As you mentioned, I started my academic career as assistant professor of sociology at UH Manoa. That was more than 20 years ago. I'm forever grateful for the support and kindness of colleagues and students in the Department of Sociology and the Center for Chinese Studies. It was a very special experience for me, and I always remember it with great fondness. So that's why today is a very special invitation for me. So turning to the book, I'll only say a few words about it, so we have enough time for conversations and questions. I wrote the book 2 years ago in the middle of the Wuhan lockdown. And since then, the pandemic situation has changed a lot, both in China and the world. In retrospect, when I look back, I'm very glad that I've written the book then and not now. Because after 2 years, our understanding of what happened in 2020 is already heavily colored by what happened later. Our memories of the Wuhan lockdown are weakened and even distant. In our eagerness to move on in our lives, we may even want to forget those experiences. But as we all know, that was a world-changing historical event, to say the least, and it deserves to be as fully documented as possible. That was actually my original goal and motivation in writing the book. I wanted to provide documentation from the perspective of a sociologist. So what did I write about? I will not repeat the chapters, but overall, I try to tell the stories of how residents in Wuhan responded to a life-threatening crisis, individually and collectively, when very little was known about the coronavirus. And there was still a great deal of uncertainty and fear, certainly far more so than now. So how did people manage this period of life? How did they respond? How did government respond? How did the people respond to government policies? That's the main storyline I try to tell. The book has 9 chapters, so I started working on it as soon as the lockdown started. The lockdown officially started on January 23rd, 2020. Because as soon as it started, I began to read lockdown diaries, and I immediately realized that these will be valuable materials for research, as I've always really enjoyed using these kind of personal documents for sociological research. In my earlier books on the Red Guard generation, I used the diaries and letters from the send-down period. In my book on the internet, I also used personal narratives, a lot of them. So I immediately realized that these will be important materials for research, and I began to collect them and start thinking about what could I write about if I were to go, to write a book. So the process of writing was was emergent. I knew I was going to write a book. I knew that these lockdown diaries will be the main materials I use, although I also use a lot of other materials, social media postings, mass media postings, photography, paintings, all kinds of documents available, as well as government policies, press releases, and Wuhan city government had public account on Weibo, on WeChat, and they had sort of daily updates about the situation. And all these kind of materials I tried to make use of, but I didn't know how many chapters I was going to write about. I started working on the book proposal in early March. I think I had a book proposal ready toward the end of March. At that time, my plan was to write 6 chapters. So obviously the plan changed. The final book had 9 chapters. So it's emergent because the pandemic itself, the lockdown itself, was uncertain. People in Wuhan didn't know when the lockdown was going to end. Nobody knew when the pandemic was going to end. We still don't know, right? Despite pronouncements that the pandemic has ended, there's still a lot of uncertainty. There's still a lot of cases. So I think I could go on, but I could also just stop here so that we can, I'm really happy to make this occasion for conversation, to respond to questions from Wei and from audience. Wei, does that sound okay?
Yeah, that's perfect. Great. Thank you, Dr. Yang Guobin, for your great introduction to your book. And let me ask you first the questions about methodology challenges. So actually, as we know that there were tons of studies available, right, since COVID, and to examine pandemic from a variety of perspectives. So for instance, myself as a medical sociologist and choose to examine mental health consequences of quarantine policies on US adults in the United States. My future plans is that using data in China to look at how quarantine policies in Chinese society may have on social isolation among older adults in China. But when I read your book, I felt that while you actually choose a very extremely challenging topic to work on, yet you did an amazing job in crafting working on this beautiful book within 1 year. So my first question is that, what motivates you to work on this project remotely? And what methodological challenges that you've encountered in this process, and how did you deal with these challenges? At the very beginning, you mentioned a little bit of like your original intention, plan is simply document something extremely important in this process. So, we appreciate that you can elaborate more regarding the data collection and challenges that you face.
Yeah, that's a very important question. Yeah, as I mentioned briefly, my main goal was to try to document, just provide documentation because I realized from reading the diaries that Wuhan residents themselves became acutely aware that this was going to be a historical event of a lifetime. It was going to not only change their own lives and families, but it was a world-changing event. So I wanted to document history and memory. I was trying, as soon as the lockdown started, I tried to read a little bit about the SARS crisis in 2003. There was quite a bit of writing from social scientists, including sociologists, anthropologists, communication scholars, but not as much as I had hoped. Of course, in 2003, the internet was already developed, not as developed as in 2020. The number of internet users in China was far smaller, and there was not as much documentation, personal narratives produced online in 2003 as in 2020. So the vast amount of material that appeared in 2020 was a long time ago, I should say. For sociologists, these kind of personal documents were considered the most valuable, precious sociological material. But for instance, in the early histories, the classic work on the Polish peasants and in Europe and America, right, based on letters by immigrants. But in recent decades, they are not used as much as they could. I try to do that actually in my previous works. So this is one thing. I have all this valuable material. Secondly, you asked about methodology. That's really a major challenge for me. Not just the sort of the typical methodological issues of selecting materials, but what kind of a book I was going to write. I did not want to write a conventional social science analysis, let's say for qualitative research based on interviews, right? How can I try to interview people in the middle of the pandemic when they were suffering, right? Who gave me the right to do that? I don't think that was ethical, especially at the time in February, March. There was so much uncertainty, such great fear. So I didn't also want to write kind of the very conventional kind of work, starting, let's say, with literature review, developing a theoretical framework for the social science analysis. That's not what I wanted to do. I do not want to be too abstract, because what we were confronted with day to day were very concrete, visceral, individual, personal experiences. Not only experiences of people in Wuhan, seem to be very far and remote and distant, but actually, I felt that I was almost there, in the sense that I have families in China, and not in Wuhan, but in other parts of China, and I do have friends in Wuhan. So in the middle of this kind of really a crisis we have never seen, nothing of this kind in our life. And I still lament this when I talk with friends and colleagues. What kind of scholarship should we produce? Am I going to develop a theory to try to explain what was happening? And something that was still happening, that was still unfolding with no certain outcome, no certain ending. So I thought the best approach, both methodologically and analytically, is to try to capture as much as possible the stories of the people who experienced the first moments of the pandemic in Wuhan. So I wanted to tell their stories, and instead of theorizing their experiences, I want to share the experiences, try to convey the kind of very strong, powerful emotional swings, emotions of fear, anxiety, uncertainty, but also emotions of friendship and love and the community, and very, very powerful feelings. And all these stories were appearing every day on social media through these personal lockdown diaries. And our timeline, I'm sure if you're on WeChat, the timeline were every day filled with these kind of personal stories. We shared, we read and we forwarded all these. And I tried as much as I could to download and save a lot of these conversations and diaries. So that's, I suppose, my methodological challenge. I wanted to write a sort of a different kind of book, at least different from the books I've written before. One that is, I don't want it to make it sound too scientific or too academic, too pedantic. I want it to be readable. I want to tell people's stories. I don't want to use a lot of concepts, a lot of theories. And I want to provide as much context as possible, social, cultural, political context behind the stories. I thought, theoretically speaking, if we want to provide kind of analysis, that's a kind of analysis. I provide the stories, I provide the context, I provide the history, and the story provide their own explanations. I did not try to sort of impose my own explanations or my own theoretical models on these stories. So that's a challenge, really a challenge in the sense I've never done this before. Was it going to work? So I wrote one sort of chapter first as a sort of experiment. Let's see whether this will work. I wanted to use a different kind of language, different kind of prose, different way of organizing, organizing the contents within the chapter and the chapters. And I felt that after finishing the first chapter, seems to be okay. It seems to have worked. Not surprisingly, I felt that, well, maybe I could try another chapter. And eventually, that's how the writing process turned out. It was very kind of experimental. I worked, I wrote, and then I wrote the drafts very fast. For the first time, I understood why journalists could write so fast. You're in the middle of powerful emotional events, and you are moved. And you want to capture that kind of emotions, capture those stories as clearly, as concretely as you can. And I thought that worked well. I thought if I had waited for 2 years, even if I had collected these data, my personal emotional responses would have been different, right? Now, 2 years later, our own emotional, we're sort of numb, no longer see what's there. And we're already beginning to forget the history of 2020, even here, right, in the United States, around us, because we're so eager to move on. So I think trying to capture that kind of experience in the moment it's sort of is a great motivation. I feel that, even today, I feel, how could I write so fast? That's because I got the energy from the people in Wuhan, from reading their stories, online. Should I stop here?
Thank you, Dr. Guobin Yang. So, I definitely can tell you that this storytelling approaches really works very well. So when I read your book and I really see, I can imagine different kind of scenes play and replayed in my mind. So different scenario. although actually I visited Wuhan in 2019, toward the end of 2019, according to your book, that pandemic cases probably already started and found in some of the Wuhan local hospitals. But I knew nothing about this until I came back to the United States. Some of my close friends, they started to chat with me. And do you know that Wuhan found some like SARS, pneumonia or something? I said, oh, really? I didn't even know about this when I was in Wuhan. So really, your book brought back a lot of memories I had in Wuhan. So this very, very touching book. And I really enjoyed reading it very much. I think this is very, very easy to read book, and not like an academic book that we had, right? A lot of abstract concepts and theories are very easy to understand. So my second question for you is that really related to the samples that you have. And actually, the diarists you included in your book were very diverse, including those COVID-19 patients, survivors, and doctors, and writers, and feminist activists, animal lovers, professors, teachers, delivery guy, and the poet, etc. So could you please tell us more about your selection criteria? Why actually, I definitely think that you went through so many diaries, right? Why you particularly including these like a group of 17 or 16 diaries in your book?
Yeah, I think I included more than 17. I quoted at least over 40 direct quotes, at least over 40 different diarists. Yeah, as you said, I collected all the diaries that I came across, I could find, and I found and downloaded and saved, and basically created an archive for my own research and writing of over 6,000 entries. And mostly these were produced by residents in Wuhan. There are also some which were produced in other parts of the country. And a small sample of pandemic diaries from overseas Chinese. So I collected all of them, and all those I could find. I follow a number of them regularly, but then I also do regular research. I don't use machine or software to do this. I want to find them myself through search engines, Baidu, Sogou, and I search regularly, and you realize that some entries I searched today, and they were not here. Tomorrow they may be there. Sometimes it's unpredictable. So I have a regular searching schedule, and I saved all of them onto my computer. Many of them have already disappeared. So then eventually, of course, I didn't, as we can't really use all of the data we have. I don't even want to think of them as data, right? These are personal documents. And at the time, at the moment when they were posted, they have their sort of a life of their own, because some of the more popular ones developed online diary communities. There are always followers, people would comment, and I would also save these comments. So how did I select those that I quote from? Here is sort of a methodological issue, and I sort of followed the traditional qualitative method of grounded research, right? I read these diaries and themes emerge over time. And at the time when I wrote my proposal, 6 major themes, and I had 6 chapters. By the time I finished the book, I had 9 chapters, because there were new developments, right? So the last chapter is about memories of Wuhan lockdown, and Dr. Li Wenliang. Chapter 8 is about nationalism. Nationalism became sort of stronger in a later period of the Wuhan lockdown. So I followed these diaries and read them closely, and began very soon. You will see that there are a number of themes that are recurrent in all diaries. The day when Dr. Li Wenliang died, almost all the diarists would write about it in their personal entries. So common themes emerge, and then that's how I sort of decided on how many chapters I was going to write and which chapter covers, what theme. There's one chapter, citizen organizing, for instance, a chapter on patients and medical workers, a chapter on called People's War, basically on government policies of militant approaches to COVID management in Wuhan and citizens' responses to them. So all these themes are emergent. And once I have these themes, it's easy to select the diaries, because then when I try to develop the stories in a particular chapter, I would use the diaries that are particularly relevant to these themes. And another thing is that for quality research, ethnography, again, from the vast amount of material you have, how do you select? You want to select those stories, accounts, material that is most revealing, that is most touching, right? That is most vivid. And that's also what I try to do. I still feel today, after finishing the book, I feel I still use too many concepts and too many theories, and I would have liked to have more stories and more quotations from these materials, but that's too late.
Thank you, Guobin. So since that you mentioned Dr. Li Wenliang, so I want to ask you a follow-up questions. So actually, in the conclusion, in the book, and you mentioned that it was this long series of scenes that made up the drama of Wuhan Lockdown. After reading your book, many scenes did play again and again in my mind, and those scenes including the Gong beating woman, and the Wuhan swearing auntie, and the female healthcare workers, say, shaving their heads, etc. So how many, however, throughout the entire book, you've only included 2 photos in your book, right? The first photo that I remember that is your cover photo, which I will show you in a minute, show the audience. The other is the photo of Dr. Li Wenliang. So you just mentioned Dr. Li Wenliang, who is a very famous physician in Wuhan Central University, who lost his life to COVID. And he's also one of the early whistleblowers, right? So you've only included these 2 photos. And could you please tell us a little bit more why you choose to only include these 2 photos in your book? Because I imagine that when you read through all these diaries, and also many of these diaries may include lots of photos in their own diaries, right? So, but you only choose these 2. And how unique is these 2 photos that make you want to include these 2 in your book?
Yeah, as you said, the book, in terms of the structure of the book and what I try to do, storytelling is the broad approach. And how do I do the storytelling? As you said, I try to focus on the presentation of concrete things that happened in the middle of the lockdown. And all these things has characters, all kinds of characters, right? Doctors, patients, delivery drivers, and government officials as well. So as I said, I didn't want, when I started writing the book, I wanted to focus on the storytelling, but in the process of writing, I began to realize that storytelling, by focusing on things, is actually my theoretical approach, in the sense that by focusing on things, and we know what things are fleeting, are momentary happenings. They are happenings, but they are fleeting, they are episodes, and they are dynamic. They are uncertain. Of course, we can analyze the things and dissect kind of institutional structure, all kinds of forces that make these things happen. But many of the things can only happen at a particular time and place. And I thought that's a very good approach, personally for me, in the sense that I do not want to present a very kind of deterministic analysis at that moment. Even today, in the book, generally, even though you can tell I have my own arguments, generally I leave the final conclusion relatively open, that readers can enter the book from any chapter and come to their own conclusions. So the reason why I didn't use many photos, there are many reasons. Practically, it's more expensive to have a lot of photos in a book, but also, photos can be to have photos, you need to have context. Otherwise, it can be misleading. These two are iconic photos. If I choose one or two, I wanted to choose Li Wenliang, right? And the other photo is also one I like, and I have a description of that, the story of that photo on the cover in the book, because I thought it captures well the kind of message the book wants to convey, a sense of hope in the middle of the pandemic. Other than that, I think the presentation of things can be done still in narrative form without relying on pictures. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Yang. So this is wonderful. Yeah, without even like showing more photos, I can use my imaginations, can imagine a lot of things in my mind. So yeah, you did a very good job in describing a lot of things in the book, so which is amazing. Another related question is that, well, actually, you've included diaries of those 17 authors, and eventually, actually, you contacted some of them for follow-up interviews, right? Some of them you did interviews, if I read your book correctly, that you did follow-up interview them remotely. So my question is that, did you get any new information beyond their written diaries? Because I imagine that you probably interviewed them after the Wuhan lockdown, right? What kind of additional information that you get by talking to those diary writers?
Yeah, the diaries that I try to reach out to all the diaries that I cited out of respect, just to let them know that I'm citing a work and asking them whether or not they want me to use their real names or they want to use, just pseudonyms. And some of them responded, others didn't. And those that responded, I sometimes ask some follow-up questions, not really sort of seriously kind of interviews. It's very informal kind of chats, including on WeChat chats, just for some clarification about details. In general, not a lot of new information. I wasn't trying to get new information. I really, out of respect, to let them know that I read their diaries. I learned a lot from them, and I want to cite one passage from their diary. Just that's the main purpose. Yeah, not all of them responded to my request. Some who responded, we had some communication, sometimes very brief. In a couple of cases, relatively detailed, and I did learn more information. One case in particular, in the chapter, I think it's chapter 5, Fire and Thunder, about medical workers and patients. There's one story of one patient called Nian, and she provided a lot more information about her diaries, and because she had one that was published, and she also wrote another diary on social media. And that was very helpful. Other than that, it's really just confirming some information, getting a permission.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yang. Another question is that, well, in the book you mentioned actually the variety of diaries, right? Including that Zhang Kangkang's missing diaries, online sex diaries, and the war diaries and death diaries. So do you mind sharing a little bit of your insights with regards to the similarities and differences between Wuhan lockdown diaries with other kinds of diaries? Yeah, you already mentioned a little bit of like the moments at the right time, right? Can you elaborate and say a little bit more about?
Major difference, of course, between diaries in the social media age and diaries like those written by Zhang Kangkang in Cultural Revolution was the medium. The social media diaries, they were shared and posted online. So I've got questions from readers and audience, such as how can you consider pandemic diaries as diaries if they're posted on social media, because diaries are supposed to be private, right? Well, not all diaries are private. Some diaries are private. Some diaries were written with the goal of publishing eventually. Plus, what is privacy nowadays? Even if you're not writing diary, nowadays, we are sharing so much information about our personal lives on social media that we probably wouldn't write in our diaries before. So social media, I think, is a major difference. Another difference is the audience. Because diaries are posted on social media, you have immediate audiences and you get immediate responses, encouragement, sometimes negative comments, but a lot of positive comments. And these kind of comments, I think of them as organic part of these kind of diary postings. So that's a major difference from traditional diaries. In terms of similarity, I think the genre of diary, the key features of the genre are still there. So pandemic diaries, people started with dates, right? With the weather, and that's the typical information we provide in traditional diaries. And it's kind of basically a running account of daily activities. Although, again, people are very flexible. There are the diaries that break the boundaries of the genre on social media. There are diaries that are mostly commentaries that not very much about personal lives, but still, I think the genre of diary, there are a lot of similarities between earlier genres and current genre. You mentioned war diaries. I cited one historian's work, Professor Aaron Moore's study of wartime diaries in a Republican period, and I think also in the anti-Japanese war period. And he showed how these diaries written by soldiers at the time were also means of self-mobilization. And I see the same kind of message in the diaries by Wuhan residents. They wrote about their lives, but also diary writing as a form of personal writing. It's a way of personal management. We take now our daily calendar book. We take notes. We have our calendar. We carefully plan. That's the way of managing your life, and it becomes especially relevant and important during times of uncertainty. And people write a lot about, how I'm going to try to persist despite all these uncertainties and crises. It's a form of mobilization, self-mobilization, very similar to the messages of the war diaries in earlier periods.
Thank you, Guobin. Very, very interesting, very nice. And just to switch our gear a little bit, toward the end, I found that volunteerism become very interesting phenomenon in the book. In the book that you mentioned that actually non-state and state volunteering Actually, by my self-observation, I really think that volunteering behaviors are not so common in the Chinese culture. However, during the COVID-19 pandemic in China, the voluntary behaviors become like one of the major forces that keep Wuhan running during the pandemic. So could you please tell us more about the voluntary behaviors that you've observed in writing this book?
Sure, as you said, there are two kinds of, at least two kinds of volunteerism during the Wuhan lockdown. One was organized by the state, grassroots local communities, party committees organized volunteers. And the other type, well, actually three types, let's say. The other type is self-organized by individual citizens. And the third type was organized by citizen groups, NGOs, other kind of community organizations. Well, actually, I could add a fourth type. I forgot how many types. I wrote many types. I wrote about many types in the chapter on civic organizing. Another type is volunteerism organized by online fandom groups. These kind of, so there, in other words, there's a lot of volunteerism, and there's a lot of similarities with volunteerism after the Sichuan earthquakes in 2008. But in 2008 was a time of sort of almost a high tide of civil society development in China, with NGOs, some Chinese scholars, in China, really excited about the outpouring of efforts, disaster relief efforts from NGO communities around the country, and they celebrated this at the end of the year 2008. There is a blue book of civil society in China published, edited by professors at Peking University, which basically announced that 2008 was the year of NGOs, year of civil society. So I talked about some differences from 2008. In 2020, during the Wuhan lockdown, there was still a lot of volunteerism, but there are a lot more that was organized by individuals. WeChat, individuals can easily build WeChat groups, and animal rescue was a very important part of this. There are all kinds of self-help groups, and this continued to appear in the Shanghai lockdown period, in other cities. But also amazing was the kind of organizing, self-mobilization by online fandom groups. As there is a very powerful culture of online fan clubs. They are organized to sort of promote. They are followers of celebrities, entertainment celebrities. They're huge, very well organized. Of course, in ordinary times, they're not doing volunteerism of this kind. They are basically doing all kinds of work related to their celebrity. But after the Wuhan lockdown started, some of these online fandom groups mobilized very quickly, and they are very powerful because they are very large. They raise a lot of money and supplies and send them to Wuhan. So that's also very powerful. NGO kind of organization was actually weaker than in 2008, which I thought reflected the kind of relative retreat of civil society as a concept and as a practice in recent years. Of course, there's still a lot of civil society activities, but a lot of the NGOs don't want to call themselves NGOs. They would rather call themselves grassroots organizations, social organizations, because NGO and civil society, these concepts in recent years have sort of become politically suspect in China's ideological atmosphere. Feminist organizing, very, very important, and they really relied on the internet. And this has a history that China has a Me Too movement, which also relied on social media, Weibo and WeChat, and Douban, all these social media platforms. So there's we can say this kind of routine of civic organizing for various causes, various purposes. but under these conditions of crisis, they can mobilize very quickly to, so that there is concentrated effort to provide support to Wuhan.
Thank you, Guobin. So now, do you mind, like, we open up the floor to welcome questions from the audience? And I already see many of them from many of very interesting questions from the audience. So let's take a look. The first question is from Professor Wang Xiaojun, and he's asking, what are the main findings besides documenting the historical event from a grassroots perspective? And his second question is that many online posts are fake for various reasons. How do you verify the authenticity of their stories? Thanks. Thank you.
The second question about authenticity of stories, we know that all these diary, especially diary postings, have their own social circles, and especially if you follow them quite closely, you'll know these are real people posting about their real experiences. One of the most controversial diaries was Fang Fang, and she was attacked for all kinds of reasons. But one kind of accusation was that she was just writing about things from her home. How could she know what was happening, right? You don't have to be there to know what was happening. You could, again, she relied on secondary sources. So, familiarity with the kind of online culture will be very helpful to help you to identify what is fake, what is the material that you can use. And nowadays I can basically tell when I read material on WeChat what I want to just pass. And there are a lot of rumors, right? But rumors sometimes can have powerful effects of mobilization. The question about main findings besides documenting this historical event from a grassroots perspective, summarizing the main finding will take a lot of time, because there are a lot of findings. Each chapter, each story is a finding, I would say, and I hesitate and actually try to avoid the temptation to reduce the book to a couple of propositions and arguments, and I still think that's a sort of appropriate approach to dealing with this very uncertain historical event. I do try to bring together the stories and the kind of conditions underlying these stories, conditions that make these stories possible in the conclusion part, without sort of trying to turn this into a theoretical explanation, but I emphasize 4 factors: the appearance of, and I won't have time to go into all of them, but the appearance of politics of appearance, active citizenship, moral feelings, and digital infrastructures. And my argument is that sort of a variation combination of these factors underlie all the major kind of stories and happens and events throughout the book. Again, if you want to talk about findings, I think one again, I really hesitate to do this. I want to present through the stories of the Wuhan lockdown, kind of a picture, as Wei said at the very beginning, try to provide kind of a lens into the conditions of contemporary Chinese life in society. And I think we see at least pictures of this contemporary life from the variety of stories. It's a panorama of stories from the Wuhan lockdown. Yeah, I will leave it there, and because again, like I said, I don't want to provide my own final conclusion. I want to have an open-ended kind of story, and so that the readers can reach their own conclusions about what exactly this all these stories add up to.
Thank you, Guobin. So another question from a sociology graduate student, Clarice, and she's asking, can you speak more about the ethical issues that came up in terms of working with a highly censored public sphere? You speak of documenting their stories that are valuable because of their personal private reflections that are not easily visible to onlookers and given the state censors. Is there criticism of the public health policies you covered in your work have implications for your interlocutors?
Yeah, that's an important question. Part of this project and the motivation for the project is an understanding of the ecology of the internet, that things disappear very quickly, and as researchers, in order to document the historical event, the first thing we want to do is to try to preserve, save the documents, and that's really kind of not only researchers like me, because of this particular culture of censorship. I would say it's only censorship. There are all kinds of reasons behind this, but people have awareness of the ephemeral, fleeting nature of online postings. I mean, here in the US as well, we know that websites would disappear, postings, website, because of all kinds of reasons, updates, content moderation. In China, we have censorship, but in general, internet scholars nowadays generally agree that online space and material is very fleeting and ephemeral, and actually that really presents a challenge for scholars. One important research, I actually just came back from a conference, special workshop on the digitization of memory in China. And one challenge, one task for researchers and citizens is to archive and save documents from the web. So when I analyzed this material, did the criticism of the public health policies you uncovered in your work have implications for interlocutors? No, not in this case, because I always used very generic kind of, I really don't cite postings directly with names, with people. And that's another reason I didn't use a lot of pictures, because a lot of pictures with screenshots. I have a lot of screenshots in my own computers, but I don't want to put them in the books. And so it's very generic kind of information. So in that sense, yeah, it's important issue we need to take into account when we do this kind of research and writing, and it's a constant struggle. I think the main challenge now is to try to preserve the material that have appeared online and save them. Here we have the Internet Archive, Wayback Machine, but even these machines, they don't save a lot of Chinese language material. I'm interested in internet history as a field of study. And if you go back to, I saved a lot of materials from 20 years ago. When I was at the UH, from my office in Sociology department, I saved and printed a lot of material. I don't know whether other people still have those materials. They have completely disappeared from cybersphere. I'm probably the only person who had that particular set of materials from that particular bulletin board at that time. So this is really important, interesting question. In the communication field, a lot of internet scholars are now turning to internet history and archiving as a field of study.
you, Guobin. Another question was proposed by Dr. Le Ling from Sociology Department, my colleague. And he's asking, he mentioned that thanks for sharing your rich and insightful book, Guobin. I'm wondering how the use of diaries helped you discover patterns and issues related to the Chinese state, such as state-society relations that may be missing in other data sources. Thank you.
That's a really good question. One thing I try to do, again, my sort of reluctance to try to theorize or try to follow some existing theoretical model is also because of, I think, some difficulties of applying some of the theoretical models and concepts out there for the study of contemporary Chinese society. Because, any theory, any model is a simplification of much complex realities. So the diaries, as you hinted, really provided kind of details, insights into everyday life, people's relationship with the state in ways that would complicate these sometimes very overarching theoretical concepts and models. Let me see whether I can think of, let's say the one of the stories I told that Wei mentioned early on, which is in chapter 3, and it's a section title is called Fake. It's an incident that happened in May, at the time when the situation was really grave, and Wuhan residents, because of the close community control, couldn't get out of home, and they had also difficulties of getting groceries. The communities were supposed to deliver groceries to them, and there were also supposed to be promises that the government would deliver some free groceries to residents on certain days. So on this day, when Vice Premier Sun Chunlan was visiting, Vice Premier Sun Chunlan was sort of the highest ranking government official, party official in Wuhan, supervising the People's War on COVID. So she was inspecting this community in mid-February. And in the middle of her tour, there were others who were with her government. Suddenly, there were shouts of residents from the buildings, high-rise buildings, just shouting, everything was fake. They were shouting, crying, fake and fake. What was fake? Because they were, the day when the vice premier was visiting, the community committee sent free deliveries, grocery deliveries to the residents, just so that it looked good when the leaders were visiting, inspecting. So the residents basically called them out. It was, you might say, this was a kind of a moment of resistance and protest. And the traditional kind of view would be, how would government respond? There will be repression, right? And there will be investigation, all that kind of stories. But what happened was that Sun Chunlan, the vice premier, immediately convened the meeting with the government officials and basically made it clear we got to solve the grocery delivery problem as soon as possible. It was kind of positive response to this incident of kind of very fleeting protest, and was captured. The voices of the citizens were captured on video, on cell phone, and they were circulated, became viral on the internet. So in some sense, the protest was circulated online, became kind of national protest. How to understand this particular moment? That's why I said early on, a focus on the stories on particular scenes is helpful in capturing this kind of dynamics, but without trying to say, I have a theory to explain this. I have some explanation, but the story itself can tell us that this is a complex civil society, citizen, state and society interaction. And would it repeat itself another time? Possible, but again, uncertainty. There is in other words, there is contingency, there is agency, there is institutional constraints. Many other examples, I think, have similar implications for understanding society relationships, and a lot of them are also captured in the diaries. People will recount these stories in their diaries and express their own opinions.
Thank you, Guobin. We received a couple more questions from the audience. One is from Chu Ying Chuan, and the person is asking that, thank you very much, Professor Yang. I enjoyed your talk a lot. I was wondering if you can share more about Dr. Li Wenliang's Weibo as a virtual wailing wall and the ways in which the state might try to manipulate collective memories, and how individuals define the state's efforts in shaping such collective memories in the digital era. Thank you.
Thank you, Wei. So is that Jack there? Professor Jack Chiu from National University of Singapore? If I heard it correctly. Thank you for the question, Jack. So this is a really, really important case for understanding many aspects of not only the Wuhan lockdown, but also, again, contemporary Chinese media culture, contemporary Chinese society, and censorship. So, Dr. Li Wenliang was the prime example of censorship in this case, because he was considered as early whistleblower, but he was, sort of in the early period, before the lockdown, early January 2020, sort of questioned by the police for posting rumors on WeChat and basically posting information about what he thought was a SARS-like disease in his WeChat group. Dr. Li was a doctor in Wuhan Central Hospital, by the way. So that was the early attempt at censorship. But after he died, there was online mourning activities and protests and censorship as well. But the internet users quickly found that he had a Weibo account, and they basically started leaving comments on his Weibo account. So many comments that they turned his Weibo timeline into a wailing wall that is often called a wailing wall now. It's even I don't know how many millions of comments now. Every day, sometimes I would check. Every day there are hundreds and hundreds of postings on his Weibo account. All kinds of postings. Initial intention of these postings was to try to keep the memory of Dr. Li alive by posting comments there, right? Because if you keep posting, then Weibo, the platform, cannot delete his account. Actually, there was one time when his account stopped functions, disappeared, the comments all disappeared, and there was a lot of protests, and then it came back. There's a lot of initial intention, but now is, people go there just to talk to Dr. Li and to share their own personal life. I'm going to go to a school has, opened, a new semester started in person, right? They would provide updates about pandemic in China. They would, a lot of people, young people, have very stressful lives, difficulties in finding a job, getting into graduate school. They would share all these stories with Dr. Li. So it's kind of a very interesting phenomenon of collective remembering of Dr. Li, and through this kind of collective remembrance, it also becomes a form of personal management, personal sharing of personal story, management of personal lives, outpouring of personal emotions. And so it's still very active. It goes on and on. I think it's amazing. It's an amazing case of collective remembrance, collective remembering and effort to keep alive the memory of Dr. Li.
Thank you, Guobin. I received a question from Dr. Sun-Ki Chai, another of your old colleague. And he is saying that, Guobin, thanks for the chance to hear you discuss about your very important and innovative book and how it came into being. I'm sure others would like to know your thoughts on how civil society has responded to current zero COVID policy lockdowns. Much has been reported in the Western press, but are there emerging major trends on social media in particular that have not been well covered? Are there new forms of expression that were not present back in 2020? Other forms that have evolved over time? So this is his question.
Yeah. Hi, Sun-Ki. Thank you. Thank you for joining our conversation today, and thank you for your question. It's a really important question. Like I said at the beginning, I'm glad that I wrote the book 2 years ago and not now, because now it's the storyline, the plot line, if there is a plot line, has become much more complicated because of these other lockdowns, the Shanghai, Shanxi, Xi'an, in many other cities, and our understanding, our attitudes toward the COVID has also sort of evolved a lot. So in terms of how things have changed, whether there are what kind of new development, I think there are certainly a lot of similarities, like the grocery shortage problem appeared in Wuhan, and we're all so surprised that grocery became such a crisis, even more serious, much more serious than in Wuhan period. And civil society, especially at the grassroots level, didn't seem to sort of start mobilizing until a little later. In the case of Wuhan, civil society mobilization started immediately as soon as the lockdown started. Nationally, people were pouring out and providing, doing fundraising and providing supplies to people in Wuhan. But in the case of Shanghai, surprisingly, it was a different kind of development. Initially, we didn't hear a lot about civic mobilization, volunteerism. And then when the food crisis became really grave, then we heard a lot about, again, citizens' own self-mobilization. They organized through WeChat and tried to coordinate deliveries of expensive groceries during the period. That's a new development. I think that's different from the Shanghai period. I'm still trying to understand. I didn't follow these cases as closely, but I did try to collect some information, and I noticed that even diaries, there were fewer diaries in Shanghai period, and these diaries appeared later on in the lockdown in Shanghai. Not again like in Wuhan, they began to appear immediately as soon as lockdown started. And also in the case of Wuhan, the diaries appeared regularly. It's a daily entry, daily posting, and it's fun, right? And it's others whose diaries were censored. Even if they were censored, they still try to keep posting every day through different platforms. Keep it going, day after day, day after day. But in the case of Shanghai, initially there were no diary postings. Later on, when there were some diary postings, it was interesting that people obviously were writing diaries, but not posting them. And then they suddenly posted 10 days of diary, 10 entries that they'd written, before but didn't post. So it's a different kind of scenario, and we might ask why, and then what kind of consequences this might have on the residents. And that's something I thought a little about. I thought the Wuhan kind of, in Wuhan, the regular diary entry postings throughout the 76-day period created kind of social rhythm, it almost became a ritual. A lot of the diary communities, the members, and I was one of them, followed these diaries every day. We knew when a particular person was going to post his or her diary on a particular day, and wanted to read it first minute and then save them before they disappear, right? So they created kind of daily rhythm, but nothing of that kind happened in Shanghai. So yes, some different scenarios since then. I'm not sure whether I answered all questions.
Yep.
Did I miss anything, Wei?
No.
Yeah, you answered all of them. So, I didn't see any more questions from the audience. So now I will invite Dr. Minbao Yu, who has a couple of questions to share with you.
Oh, thank you, Wei. Thank you,
Thank
Guobin,
you.
for this wonderful dialogue and this wonderful book you have written. People probably don't know, but Guobin has actually a PhD in literature that he obtained in China before he came to this country. And I was absolutely in awe when I read your book. The humility, the erudition, and the lucidity of your writing. It was absolutely, everybody should read it, and as Wei said, it's not just about the Wuhan lockdown. It is really a handbook on what's going on in contemporary China, and providing the historic and political context that is so often ignored, right, in the West. So my question, I'm trying to combine a couple of things and following up on what people have already asked, and of course, in many of your books, you mention the relationship between the state and citizens, right, and the issue of whether there is a civil society in China, which has been, a huge debate among scholars. And what I find very fascinating and convincing in your book, and you've elaborated in your answers, right, there's no doubt there is sort of a form of civil society in China, right? And that state and civil society are not necessarily or mutually antagonistic or exclusive. In fact, your example of these fan clubs and all, they all show, that actually the relationship can be complementary rather than antagonistic, as most people who are not familiar with China, would claim or think. My question then, sort of a spin-off of that, really leads to another aspect of your book that I found really, really, intriguing, is what I would call the specter of the Cultural Revolution. I think it looms really large in your book. At several places, right, you mention, how, for example, in your chapter on the loudspeakers that were used during the COVID lockdown in Wuhan, right? And everybody knows during the Cultural Revolution, loudspeakers were very important. And you talk about the wolf warriors, right, in China, and then you say it taps sort of into China's indigenous history and a style of populism, right? And you also, when you talk about cyber nationalism, you mention these pink guards, right, which is of course a derivation of the red guards, to indicate, they're sort of less, maybe a fainter version, as you call it, right? And even when you talk about the government's policy of globalizing expansion of China's media, you mentioned that already happened under Mao, right? So the picture you paint of the Cultural Revolution is, of course, very different from what most people in the West are familiar about, right? And most people would find it very, very difficult to understand, what do we do with the sort of what Elizabeth Perry has called a warlike reinforcement of politics during the Wuhan lockdown. That's an enactment of familiar political logic with roots in the Chinese Communist Revolution, right? So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about, how certain aspects of and lessons from the Cultural Revolution are being reenacted, right, here, to quote Perry, and rather than being suppressed in contemporary China, right? And we all know the book that Yuhua wrote about two brothers, about two former Red Guards, right, who become extremely successful in China's, new era of global capitalism, right? So this is a very different narrative and picture of the Cultural Revolution, not the sort of the West is familiar with, the victimization, right, and the persecution, but it's actually drawing on experiences or maybe a spirit or something that actually unexpectedly, right, is helping people, contemporary Chinese people, to survive in this, new age of global capitalism, and even, helping them coping with the Wuhan lockdown.
Yes, thank you, Mingbao. That's a very big, important question. You mentioned Liz Perry's work. On this, I'm completely with Liz Perry's point. And actually, in my own work, I was inspired by her analysis of the kind of cultural continuity of ways of governing in China. And if you think about it, Chinese regime is a revolutionary regime. The state power, revolutionary regimes have their ways of doing things. There's the kind of logic of state power persists for a long time. The particular methods may vary, right? There are different ways of doing things, but the logic, that's what I think Liz Perry meant by the political logic of the revolutionary regime persists, and I completely agree. For instance, even the ways of doing things, there are also continuities. For instance, the use of political campaigns. Of course, in Maoist period, political campaigns were a major form of politics, and it has weakened somewhat, but political campaigns continue to be important, including, for economic policies, propaganda, all sorts of policy enforcement implementation. There's still a lot of reliance on the same methods. Even more specifically, you mentioned the example of the use of loudspeakers.
Yeah.
That's almost like the kind of urban landscape of the Maoist period. We heard that it can sound, was defined by loudspeakers, whether it was still in the Cultural Revolution or in ordinary times. In rural villages, loudspeakers were kind of, just waking people up for in the morning and get them to work in schools as well, right?
Right.
In recent decades, and I wrote a little bit about this revival of this loudspeaker culture in the recent decades. It's the same method, except that the loudspeakers nowadays are digitalized. They are networked. They're connected to the internet, so it's easy just to download some songs or a slogan and then repeatedly play them on the loudspeaker, but still the loudspeakers. Right. So it's really, that's a kind of enactment of an enduring script, you might say. It's a script of revolution. It's also a script of revolution of state power.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, well, we're out of time. We only have 4 minutes left. I just wanted to remind people to please fill out the survey that we're sending to everyone, right? It only takes you a minute or two to fill it out. And then again, I wanted to thank my colleague Zhang Wei for this wonderful conversation she had with Guobin. And of course, Guobin, thank you so much for fitting us into your busy schedule. We know you're in high demand. I was trying to get him last semester actually, and he was not available. So we're very lucky we could get him today. And everybody, you should buy the book. Is there also an online version available, Guobin, or is it only in paperback?
There is a Kindle version.
Oh, there's a Kindle version. Wow, that's good. Okay, so thank you, everybody. Please go and buy this book. And, as Guobin said, the book is so accessible, but yet at the same time, it deals with so many complex issues, and he has put it very beautifully. And even though he said he didn't want to use a lot of theory, he has used, very, very interesting theory here and there, right, to make it very, very accessible. So anyway, thank you to our audience for joining us today. Thank you for your wonderful questions. And again, a very short reminder to please join us next week for the interregional and interdisciplinary faculty panel that focuses on President Biden's Indo-Pacific policy and strategy. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Guobin. Thank you,
Mingbao. Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Wei.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. See you later.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.